the process.
Oh, okay.
Okay, that's a simple way of explaining it.
Okay. Well, yeah, and then they have robotic surgeries and all kinds of
Right.
stuff, you know. So your doctor's in Australia.
Exactly.
Well, I feel good about that one.
At least it's not a hologram dissecting you or something.
Right.
Okay. So we have a quick review, and I'm going to play to start with this little clip of Pharaoh. And of course, this is the biblical version. So,
Oh, right.
like we said, I mean, who could play Pharaoh better than you, O'Brien? Aaron, Moses. Yes. So, well, I think we'll get that out of the way before I lose the connection here.
Unless I left him in the car, which I could. Oh, well, I'll just get a new pair.
Let's see if we can get it going here. Well, that was pretty dramatic. When you think that was made in the 1950s, the special effects of that, I mean, that's pretty good. That wasn't computer generated, I don't think.
No, not that.
So, but that proved it right there. We're going to get to that Pharaoh did live through.
Yeah.
So.
That's proof.
But, and if he did live through it, I mean, that was an awfully neat response, like, oh my goodness. And so, anyways, get the light back on here.
I can do it.
Okay. So last week we did talk about how, in chapter 14, how Pharaoh knew where they were, is he probably had spies following them. That makes a lot of sense. And he really probably thought they're lost, no doubt, and that they were going to be easy picking. And like that little phrase where he said there, like, this isn't a job for Pharaoh, this is a job for a butcher. And he probably, I don't know if he was wanting all of them killed because he wanted some of the slaves back, of course, but I'm sure he wanted revenge on Moses. So in the army really did have motivation. You'd think, why would they want to do that? Well, they had just lost their firstborn sons. And they had lost probably their economy, and they wanted revenge. Like we said, much like the Russians coming into Germany and Berlin, that they had known what had happened. They had lost family members when Germany had invaded, and that's why all of the Germans were running to the other side, running to the Americans, to the west. So, but it's amazing that the hard hearts that Pharaoh had. I mean, that had to be just divine, because logically that didn't make a lot of sense after all they had gone through. To still think, he could still, beat God.
Well, he was a god, wasn't he?
Well, he had not lost that. It was that idea that, right, I mean, he hasn't beaten me yet. I'm still standing. So, and the Israelites, when they saw the predicament they were in, first of all, they blamed God, they blamed Moses, which was going to be a continuing pattern. But like I mentioned last week too, how we're really proud of Moses at this stage, where he stands up and he says, no, I'm not gonna enter this debate. You know, God is going to deliver us. And that wasn't what he was like at the beginning of this whole episode, where he kind of went, he would say, yeah, you know, they're right, you know. I'd rather be in Midian. The sheep were hard to take care of, but a lot nicer than this. And it says, you know, the Bible, it says that they were sore afraid. And I can understand them being sore afraid. So one of the complaints wasn't there enough graves in Egypt? I mean, that's pretty cheap. And later on when they're complaining to Moses, Moses said, and Aaron said, you know, why are you complaining about us? We're just men. But the analogy to us is that we're also helpless and hopeless without Christ. And going across the Red Sea was kind of their salvation. And it doesn't mean that they were now okay. We know that. And we mentioned last week too that, you know, it was easier to get them out of Egypt than to get Egypt out of them.
Yes.
You know, they had 400 years of mentality of being in Egypt as slaves, surrounded by that culture, which had taken the effect on them. So Moses gets the instructions, he follows them. You know, he has the pillar of fire and cloud. I mean, that should have been enough to let the people know that God was protecting them. And it also should have been a red flag, again, to Pharaoh, saying, whoa, let's go back. This doesn't look good on paper here. And people have tried to explain all of this natural means. You know, there was an earthquake, there was a tsunami or whatever, or they went across the Sea of Reeds because it was only 6 inches deep. And, but there's no real explanation unless it was a miracle.
And it also says they walked on dry land.
Right, just for that wind to dry it. I'm sure it was muddy otherwise.
Yeah.
And God allowed the mud to come back when the Egyptians,
Yeah, because they broke their chariots.
right, their chariots got stuck in the mud, right? They didn't have all-weather tires, so.
The Goodyear tires were gone.
Yeah, they should have
It
Michelin.
wasn't a good year.
But the little video we showed last week too of that archaeological, where they dove down and they've seen chariot wheels encrusted with coral. I mean, that's pretty amazing. I don't know how they would get there otherwise. And it's reasonable that, you know, the coral could encrust them and keep their shape. So,
Jacques Cousteau dropped them off.
yeah, it was the dump truck that came and dumped them all there, old chariots and cars. Well, they've done that with old cars. They've thrown them in the ocean and then they become coral reefs and habitat for fish. So maybe that's what they were thinking.
I'm sure.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so we're in chapter 15 now. And like we said, last week we did talk about, you know, whether Pharaoh lived through it or not. And I looked up some things and I thought it was interesting. I had never thought of that Pharaoh had died in it. I just never thought of it. And apparently, according to this little clip I found, although the Christian community historically has accepted that the Exodus Pharaoh died in the Red Sea when his army drowned, there is no such statement to this effect in Exodus. The only first-hand source for the event, or anywhere else in Scripture, One of the most important principles that was taught to the present writer during his seminary studies is this: say everything the text says, say no more, say no less. Saying more than what is written in the text is known as eisegesis, or reading into the text what the interpreter presupposes it to say. Eisegesis must be avoided here. What does the text actually say about the fate of this Pharaoh? Moses only states the Lord would be honored through Pharaoh by this destruction of his army. But throughout the entire narrative of Exodus, Moses never explicitly states that Pharaoh died along with his army. So, an interesting perspective there. And like I said, I had never heard before last week that somebody would say that Pharaoh died. And apparently that's, historically, the Christian community has said that. I guess I've been in the wrong Christian community. So they're singing loud and clear, while a few hours earlier they were groaning. So chapter 15, verses 1 through 3, why don't we read that?
Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider, he is hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him. My Father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is the warrior. The Lord is his name.
Isn't that a wonderful verse? And, you know, it's interesting that I think we call this in modern terms being fickle pickles or changeable Charlies. You know, I mean, within a few hours, here they go from, what are you trying to do, kill us? Weren't there enough graves? And then singing this song. So, you know, apparently Moses probably did write it or came up with the words. And in the book of Revelation, it does mention, you know, that the people sing the song of Moses. So, which is an appropriate song for, you know, just our salvation as well. Let's look up 1 Corinthians 10:11. And this is, and then somebody will get 1 Corinthians 10:1 through 2. So first, 1 Corinthians 10:11.
These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come.
Yeah. So these things weren't just for them. It's written for us. And then 1 Corinthians 10:1 and 2.
What?
1 and 2.
Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud and passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink.
So once again, all of these things that we're seeing have symbolic reasons too for us in the New Testament, which I think is pretty cool. And so he wasn't just writing it down as history, he was writing it down that would be used, you know, 2,000 years later. And then Hebrews 11:29. Matthew, Mark, Hebrews.
By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned.
Yeah. So once again, it was by faith. And it would have taken faith, you know, considering the state they were in, thinking that this was the end. But, I mean, it must have been pretty remarkable, though. I mean, obviously, you see the water, I mean, we don't know how wide it was, but it was probably, you know, a mile wide. I mean, and you had to get 2 million people through pretty quick. So by faith, and symbolic of baptism, written for our admonition, you know, not, and it says later too, you know, not to complain like they did. So the whole idea too is that Christ is the one who takes us out of bondage and into his deliverance. Bible also indicates that the angel of the Lord, which is a pre-incarnate Christ, was in the fire and the cloud, you know, protecting them. Now, there's a similar song later on in the book of Judges that Deborah and Barak, that they sing a song in somewhat similar fashion when they defeated. I mean, some of it's kind of a gruesome song, you know, like put the pig through the guy's head or whatever, you know. But now, chapter 15, 4 through 6. Why don't we read that? Now, that's pretty graphic as well. The Bible never shies away from, I guess, being graphic sometimes. Chapter 15, verses 4 through 6. Exodus 15, yeah. Yeah, we're doing a little sword drill here.
Yeah. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has hurled into the sea. The best of Pharaoh's officers are drowned in the Red Sea. The deep waters have covered them. They sank to the depths like a stone. Your right hand, O Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shattered the enemy.
Right. So they sunk like a stone. Of course, they had armor on too, I'm sure that didn't help. So they'd come out of the land of hundreds, maybe thousands of different idols. And one of our videos indicated that what Pharaoh probably thought was, there's one more that hasn't been defeated yet, that's the god of war. And he hasn't failed me yet. So we're going to do that one. And it could have been too that Pharaoh, just feeling he was a god too, that he was not defeated completely yet. But
Everybody was saying that he's good.
yeah, I mean, that was part of the deal. I mean, his wife probably didn't think so. Or you know, even gods take out the garbage, come on. So, chapter 15, 11 through 13, this one explains or describes who is like thee. Chapter 15, 11 through 13.
Who among the gods is like you, O Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders? You searched out your right hand, and the earth swallowed them. In your unfailing love, you will lead the people you have redeemed. In your strength, you will guide them. In your holy dwelling, the nations will hear and tremble. Anguish and grip the people of Philistia. The chiefs of Edom will be terrified. The leaders of Moab will be seized with trembling. And the people of Canaan will melt away.
And we find out that was really true, didn't we? When they got to Jericho, remember, Rahab said that to the spies. She said, "We've heard about you guys." So, this was before the internet.
Yeah.
So the word got through caravans or whatever, but the word of mouth traveled all the way to Canaan and said, "These guys are coming." And of course, king of Moab, he knew they were coming, and he said, "Man, we gotta nip this in the bud. We gotta go get them." And the Amalekites too, for that. There's that song, "There is none like you," and that really fits this passage too. And certainly, after destroying all of those idols and their power in Egypt, and the god of war, and the power of Pharaoh, they could certainly say that there is none like you. There is no God like you. And probably even the Egyptians back home, the normal everyday, they're thinking that too. This wasn't a fluke.
Yeah.
So in verses 18 through 19, Moses keeps repeating this, and it's one of the themes, I think, of the Old Testament. Don't forget. Remember to tell your children, tell your grandchildren, while you walk in the way and while you lay down, keep reminding, and it was an oral tradition, of course. They didn't have Eggemeyer's Bible story book. So it had to be carried on, by the parents, generation to generation. Let's read verse 20 through 21. I think this is interesting here too.
Then Miriam, the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women followed her with tambourines and dancing. Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea."
Is that a tambourine?
No, I think it's birds. Crickets?
Yeah.
Could be crickets.
So, that must have been quite the, you're talking probably 1 million women going out into the field with tambourines.
It's amazing that they brought their tambourines with them. They must have thought that was something they really needed, huh?
Yeah.
Well, they took everything when they left Egypt.
Their tambourines. Okay, well.
Or they made them on the way?
Yeah.
Oh, maybe, I don't know.
Now, this is interesting because this is in 70 years, this is the first mention now of Miriam again. The last time we saw Miriam, she's a teenage girl by the river watching over baby Moses. And now she's called a prophetess too.
Yeah.
She was right up there. And I was thinking too, the big sisters always watch over their baby brothers, even as adults.
Yeah.
Although later on, we'll see, she does get in trouble because she starts dissing Moses, saying, has God only spoken through you?
Yeah.
What about Aaron and me? And what about this wife of yours? She's not an Israelite, And what happened? Well, she got leprosy. And one of the shortest prayers in the Bible is Moses says, "Lord, heal her." And he said, well, she's going to have to spend 7 days out of the camp because she had leprosy. But yes, I'll heal her. So Moses was looking out after his big sister as well. So she was probably, a good 13 years older than him anyways. Now, Now we're talking only 3 days later verses 22 through 23. 3 days. I mean,
Then Moses led
Yeah, okay.
Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water.
yeah,
When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter.
okay.
That is why the place is called Marah.
Yeah. So how soon we forget, right? I mean, 3 days. Now, if you haven't drank anything for 3 days, you're getting pretty parched. So I understand that, especially if you see your kids suffering. Mommy, I'm thirsty. Or if you're breastfeeding and you're not drinking anything, you're getting pretty dehydrated too. So I'm sure there was, a real suffering, but you think you have 2.5 million people. How much water do you need? A lot. Think of all the fire hydrants that would have to be opened up, and there weren't any.
Think of all their livestock.
And all their livestock,
Oh, yeah.
exactly, and they were suffering too, and bleeding and moaning and mooing, and so. Now, Egypt had been a land of plenty. They had the Nile, I'm sure they had irrigation ditches, and even if they were slaves, apparently they had a lot of water. They probably had their own little victory gardens, and so they had lots of fruit and food. So even though they were slaves, it was still, they had their daily needs met, per se. So now, 3 days later, once again, you think of ourselves too, how often we forget. And that's why God says, remember. So as believers who are saved, especially, there can be a longing for the good old days of life. That when things seemingly were going better. Now Swindoll calls this phase the baby steps in the desert. God is going to take them and mold them. And part of this is showing that God does care for them. But you can imagine, they come to this place, water, water, oh man, it's it's brackish or it's bitter, and another disappointment. And you think sometimes, why didn't God just zap them into the land of Canaan and avoid all this mess? Or take a quick route, through the land of the Philistines? Because you think, logically, well, if Egypt was the modern, mega country, the best army in the world, could the Philistines be more of a trouble? But God chose not to do that. And like we mentioned, they could have gone along the coast up, and probably that would have been a richer land, not a desert perhaps. And they could have gotten to Philistine and along the Mediterranean. And however, the Philistines weren't too friendly. So Deuteronomy 8:2, somebody read that. Because this answers that question. Why didn't God do that? So we're jumping ahead. I'm sure the people were asking that question too. Hey, let's get there quick. Are we there yet? Deuteronomy 8:2, I think that's right.
And you shall remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness those 40 years, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not.
Right. There you go. Why did he send them through there? He needed to humble them, test them, know what's in their heart, whether you will keep his commandments or not. Somebody has said once that if you're in second grade, if you don't pass second grade, you're not getting to third grade. At least it used to be that way. So, you know, when you have trouble, you know, the roots of prairie plants go very, very deep in the soil because they're exposed to drought and hard times. But that makes them able to survive even when fires go through, they can sprout back up. And that's, you know, the same analogy that God is using with them. He says, I'm gonna make them into my people. Somebody has said too that it could have been 40 days to get there. Instead it was 40 years. And we kind of joked about Moses too. Why did God take 40 years to prepare Moses in Midian? Because he couldn't do it in 39.
Yeah.
So, well, they're in the wilderness of Shur, the wilderness of Sin. Tom was wondering about that one. It's also called Zan, I guess, and Etham. And they're on their way to Sinai. I think it's interesting that Moses was prepared. He knew that area. He had been there before. He knew the routes. So God was using Moses' background knowledge as well. And they were on their way to Sinai. Somebody read verse 23 through 26 in Exodus. I don't know, did Tom read some of that already, or?
When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That is why the place is called Marah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, what are we to drink? Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it in the water, and the water became sweet. There the Lord made a decree and a law for them, and there he tested them. How far were we supposed to go?
26.
Oh, okay. He said, if you listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you.
Yeah, that's, so the word Mara, now if you remember, that word is used, I remember, later in the Bible too. Naomi, when she's coming out of Moab back to Israel, she says, don't call me Naomi anymore, call me Mara, because my life has been bitter. So, they're murmuring part 2. And that's only part 2. So, but Moses intercedes, and this is kind of a weird thing. God tells him to throw a tree into the water, and the water was made sweet. Now that doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm going to read something in a bit about what the rabbi tradition says about that. But I do not know of any natural use of a tree making water good. And in that this could be symbolic of Christ on the cross.
Oh, sure.
That makes some sense. When you think of, we should always view through our lens the Old Testament. How does this point to Christ? And this could be one of those times as well. Now we don't, I think one version says a stick into, and another one says a tree. You know, hey, all you guys pull up this tree and throw it in.
Could have been sapling.
You're right.
Well, they were in the desert still.
Yeah, they were, but there are some trees that do grow in the desert.
Yeah, probably not a big tree, no.
Not big trees, no. Yeah, they're not weeping willows probably, for sure. Now, rabbi tradition offers several opinions on the nature of the wood utilized by Moses. Rabbi Joshua, he's a charcoal maker by trade, said that it was a willow. Interesting. Rabbi Nathan said it was a type of bitter ivy. Rabbi Eliezer Hamoda surmised that it was an olive tree. Rabbi Joshua ben Korsha hypothesized it was a thistle bush. To all opinions, the consensus seems to be that the wood was bitter. And, you know, Elisha, if you remember, there was some water that was bad, and he threw, I think, some meal into the water, and that, I'm not sure, he threw something in the water, and the water was good to drink too. Once again, we don't have to come up with a completely natural explanation for everything. That God could have just said, okay, it's good. Or just touch it with your staff and it will be good. You know, why he said throw a tree in, we'll have to ask that one in heaven, I guess.
He's the healer of the water.
He's the healer of the water. On the other hand, Rabbi Simeon, the phrase is God taught Moses Torah. According to his interpretation in this verse, refers to Etz Hayamin Hi, meaning it, the Torah, is the tree of life. In a similar vein, Torah Mekinim brings a beautiful literal meaning from Zohar, suggesting that it was a piece of wood from the original tree of life in the Garden of Eden. Now that's a little far-fetched, but we don't take rabbi tradition as scripture either. So, but that's interesting. I don't know what a branch from the tree of life in the Garden of Eden was doing in the middle of the
Much
desert.
of what we're reading is far-fetched. It's a reach.
Yeah. But it's true. We know that it's true because the Bible says that it's true, that it was a tree that got thrown in.
Well, it still sounds far-fetched.
Miracles are.
And I'm remembering now Elisha threw salt into the water to make it good. And it was meal that he threw into some poisoned porridge. But, you know, God does promise to care. Now, he mentioned a very interesting verse that says, none of these diseases will I visit upon you. Diseases of that world, even when they look at some of the mummies, they were suffering from a lot of illnesses. Even the pharaohs who would have had a kind of shelter life, they had maybe TB, they had, who knows, malaria. But in this book, None of These Diseases, written by Dr. a long time ago, it's got some modern publications of it as well. It says, the Bible presents devastating disease and senseless suffering, explodes the myth, erases irreconcilable grief and mind-poisoning guilt. Well, one of the things he says here, although Europe brought its most devastating plagues under control by obeying the biblical injunctions to isolate the victims, other important diseases continued to decimate mankind because people did not take seriously God's promise that they would be freed from all the diseases by their obedience to all the divine regulations. Hence, intestinal disease such as cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever continued to take a heavy toll of lives. Up to the close of the 18th century, hygienic provisions, even in great capitals, were quite primitive. It was the rule for excrement to be dumped into the street, which was unpaved and filthy. Powerful stenches gripped villages and cities. It was a heyday for flies, and they bred in the filth and spread intestinal disease that killed millions. Such waste of human lives that could have been saved if people had only taken seriously God's provision for freeing man of diseases. With one sentence, the book of books pointed the way to deliverance from the deadly epidemics. You shall set off a place outside the camp And when you go out to use it, you must carry a spade along your gear and dig a hole, have easement, and turn to cover the excrement. You know, even in London, which was a fairly modern city, when the bubonic plague and everything came through, London burned down, and actually that was a good thing, because it killed all of the slums and the rats, and they rebuilt it better. I remember reading about the bubonic plague in Europe, and the Jews were blamed because they noticed, hey, these Jews aren't getting the bubonic plague as much as we are. And so they must be cursing us, so let's persecute them. Let's drag them out and get rid of them. Rather than saying, well, what are they doing different? Well, they were living more by the Mosaic law of cleanliness. They weren't throwing their excrement out into the street in the morning and having it washed down into the rivers. And still in places of the world, you know, that's still a problem. You know, Pastor Steve was talking about in Congo, how, you know, digging of the wells and providing funds for that was so important because it helped eliminate the waterborne diseases, which are so prevalent. You know, even in India, you know, they still throw everything in the water, in the river, and then you go bathe in it or get your drinking water from it. And
I have a brother who went and visited in India, and he said it's one of the filthiest places he's ever been.
yeah. And you'd think, now, in this modern times, and having somewhat of a British influence there, that would have been cleaned up.
Well, Vietnam was that way in the 60s.
Okay, yeah. If you've ever played the game Oregon Trail, I don't know if any of you ever did that video game, but one of the things that you would die of along the way was cholera when you're heading out for the Oregon Trail. And that was a big problem back then too, you know, the water wasn't good. And if you're really thirsty, you're maybe gonna drink anything. Even when I was on Isle Royal, they told you to, and which is a pretty pristine place out in the middle of Lake Superior, they said, don't drink the water, boil it, because the moose have parasites in them, and you to get the moose fluke. And I don't want to get a moose fluke.
Along with whales anyway.
And even up in the Rocky Mountains, they say don't drink it because I think it's Giardia. Yeah, but that's also prevalent there. So none of these diseases, you know, very, you know, he talks about just, you know, mental health too. And how stress is one of the biggest culprits in our modern day of other diseases. So, well, the rules, you know, which they didn't understand, we have to remember that. They didn't understand the germ theory of disease. They didn't have microscopes. The germ theory of disease wasn't really discovered until Pasteur, right? I mean, after the invention of the microscope, and even after that, they didn't know for sure that was the cause. You know, when you say what you don't know won't hurt you, that's not true. Okay. So, he also points out in that book too that even circumcision has, you know, health benefits, that there are less diseases among Hasidic Jews and stuff because they practice circumcision still. I think that's kind of going out of style now in the Gentiles. I think that's been one of the big decisions.
Pediatricians even speak against circumcision. They claim that there is no medical proof that circumcised or uncircumcised makes a difference in health. But it's known that it does. And so, yeah.
Right.
But there is proof that their women have less trouble
Right. less uterine cancer and
Yeah,
stuff. Yeah.
with,
Well, there's even less diseases among men.
Right,
I
yeah.
don't care about the men.
Appreciate your honesty.
And the other thing he points out is, that the eating habits, they wouldn't eat pork or unclean. And they didn't understand that, especially back in those days, pork would carry trichinosis because of the eating habits of the pigs. There's the old joke, can you eat pork and go to heaven? And the answer is you can eat pork and get there sooner. So the pig farmers don't want to hear that. And of course, trichinosis is a really, terrible thing. There's no real cure for it once you get it. It's in your muscle. And I think modern farmers are, at least in America, are pretty.
Pigs are treated.
Yeah, yeah. I had a cousin who had been a vet, and then he became a meat inspector for the government. And that was one of the things they look for in the meat lockers. They inspect the meat, making sure that it didn't have trichinosis in it.
I don't know about now, but at one time, in our lifetime, other countries did not allow American pork to come into their country because it was contaminated with trichinosis.
I know bears can carry trichinosis too, and there's been, and it's raw meat as well, which there's been. I remember when I had a Health 101 when I was in college, and one of the books we had to read was 7 Blue Men, and it was talking about men who died of certain diseases and why they died. And I think one of them was, trichinosis.
I learned after I got out of college that whatever they said wasn't always true. I had an economic geography course, and they said that if you cut down all the trees and such in the jungle, and the soil became laterite, is what they called it, it could not be restored. Well, that has since been proven false, and I had a nasty concession for that one. I didn't like him.
Remember, what is it, what's the old saying, Reed? Believe only half of what you see and none of what you hear, or something like that. So there is a connection between lifestyle and certain diseases. I think that's, pretty well documented. Sometimes the world doesn't want to admit that, though. If you remember back in the 70s and 80s when HIV came out, nobody wanted to say that it was, that bathhouses where gay men frequented were part of the problem. They didn't want to say that because that was politically incorrect. And the same thing now with monkeypox. They don't really want to advertise that it's frequenting gay men the most.
Now you're supposed to call it mpox, not monkeypox.
Well, then monkeypox was also, yeah.
I mean, it's the same thing, but now politically it's supposed
Yeah.
to say,
Yeah.
doesn't sound as bad, I
Yeah.
guess.
So, Exodus 15 now too, they finally reach an oasis. So there's 70 palms and 12 wells, and now we're good. Okay, God has provided. So behind every Mara, there can be an Elam, and this was called the Oasis of Elam. And Elam is it's a word that we use today. It's the name of like some nursing homes, like Elam up in Princeton, I think. Elam. Elam Baptist, right? Yeah. Now, J. Vernon McGee talks about this section. He says, Elam was a place of abundant blessing and fruitfulness. There were 70 palms and 12 wells. After the bitterness of Mara, God brought his people to Elam. Weeping may endure for the night, but joy comes in the morning. Simon Peter may be locked in the inner prison, but the angel is going to open the door. Paul and Silas may be beaten at midnight, but an earthquake will free them. There is a Mara along the pilgrim pathway today, but friend, there is also an Elam. God's plan for usefulness always leads to Mara and to Elam. Joseph, you remember, had that experience. Moses did, Elijah did, David did, Abraham Judson did, John Patton did, and I'm sure you and I will have that also. Beyond every Mara, there is an Elam. Behind every cloud, there is the sun. Behind every shadow, there is the light. Behind every trial, there is triumph. And beyond every storm, there is a rainbow. George Matheson wrote, I trace the rainbow through the rain. This is the way God leads us. All of these things happened to Israel, for examples to us. Well, we're going to move on to chapter 16 here, and we'll do that next week. So one of the titles, oh, not meeting next week. Actually, the next 2 weeks we're not, and unless Steve takes January 4th, we're not, and then he's going to take 11th. January 4th and the 11th, I have to be up at Spectrum High School for something. So, so we will, you can read ahead. So one of the titles of chapter 16 is The Exam Continues. And
15, you said?
16 is going to be next. And Swindoll points out about this. He says, remember, he says, there's no spiritual gift of grumbling.
Take that off the list.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
So we have the faithful 9 here.
Every once in a while, you see a funny one like this.
Very good. So behind every Mara, there is an Elam. Okay.